Do you want to bake bread that's bland, flat, and overproves easily? I thought not. So let's talk about the key ingredient that is salt and why you should add it to your bread dough. Whether you love baking sourdough loaves or yeasted breads like this olive ciabatta I'm about to pop into the oven, or even in rich, delicious breads like these cinnamon rolls, salt is a key ingredient to add into your bread. Salt doesn't just add flavour to your bread, it also plays a crucial role in helping your dough rise and the structure of your final loaf or breads. That's not to say that there aren't breads made without salt. You may even have made my 2-ingredient flatbread recipe. That has no salt in it. But those breads usually accompany a meal full of flavour, perhaps to mop up a sauce at the end. If you're baking yeasted loaves like a crusty sandwich loaf or like the breads I'm making here, you'll definitely need to add salt, and you will notice if you forget. So what does salt do in your homemade bread? Well, first up, flavour. Your yeast are busy breaking down the starches in the flour when you make your dough. And those produce sugars and other compounds that do add flavour, but your salt is there to really enhance that. You'll notice if you do forget salt that your bread does turn out quite bland tasting, maybe not even any kind of flavour. Next up, salt has an effect on the gluten structure of your loaves. You can see with these ciabatta, they're still holding their shape, even though it's a very wet dough and they're quite flat, but they haven't really spread out and they're ready to go almost into the oven now. So when you make your dough, your flour and water mix, and that's when gluten forms. It's two proteins that bind together in the dough, forming gluten. It's like a stretchy elastic band, and it really holds like a scaffold in your bread, holding the shape of your final loaf or buns like these, that delicate swirl in the cinnamon rolls. When you add salt, it firms up and strengthens that gluten network, really adding to the structure of your loaf and making sure your dough rises really well to get that light, airy loaf of bread you are hoping for. If you don't add salt, you may notice that your dough is really stretchy, but actually a bit harder to shape. You might find that keeping the dough in the shape that you're hoping for is a bit harder, and that your dough rises a bit too quickly as well. And that's a third reason to add salt to your dough. Yeast and salt really shouldn't mix, in that if there's too much salt around and yeast starts to absorb it, it will slow down and eventually stop the yeast activity. And the yeast are there to produce gas to rise your dough. So when the salt is added into your dough, it will slow down but not stop the yeast. It's actually really helpful because it gives plenty of time for the yeast to break down the starches in the flour and produce lots of flavour in your final loaf. So salt has plenty of effect on not only flavour, but also the structure of your final loaf and controlling slightly how quickly your loaf rises. So what kind of salt can you use in your bread? Well, you may have your table salt, very fine salt like I have here, and that often will have an anti-caking agent in. So if you want to avoid that, you could also use something like these bigger salt flakes, which are just pure sea salt. If you do use those, then crush them up before you put them into your bread, as they are quite large, and you may just end up with chunks of salt through your dough. And when should you add the salt to your bread dough, and how much should you be adding? Well, with most yeasted breads where you're just mixing flour, salt, water and yeast, you can add your salt in with the flour when you weigh out your ingredients. Keep it separate from any yeast that you're using and mix them in so that the flour acts as a buffer. Sometimes you might add your salt in a second stage. For example, the ciabattas that I just showed you, those have an overnight dough with no salt in it, and then the final dough is made up the next day and the salt is added later on. That two-step process can really help your yeast get a head start in breaking down the starches in your flour and creating all of that flavour in your final dough. Similarly, if you're baking sourdough, there's often a step where you make up your final dough and then add the salt in towards the end of the first rising time. This is especially important as a sourdough starter has a lot less yeast in it than using commercial dried yeast. And so you want to give the sourdough starter and the yeast in it as much chance as possible as rising your dough before adding in that salt, which can slow down the yeast. In terms of how much you add, generally you may add about 2% of your flour weight For example, if you're using 500 grams of flour, you'd add 10 grams of salt. However, you can reduce the salt you put into your bread, and that's a great reason to bake your own at home because you know how much you put in. You can reduce it to about 1.5 to 1.8% of your flour weight, so maybe between about 7 or 8 grams in 500 grams of flour. So if you'd like to bake breads that are well risen and full of flavour, don't forget to add the salt when you make bread at home. It's what's going to help turn your flour, water and yeast into a delicious masterpiece that you can't wait to share. And if you found this useful, do give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more bread making tips. You can also sign up for my regular newsletter for more bread making tips and recipes, as well as information on my classes and more. And that link is below this video. Enjoy baking your bread at home, and I'll be back soon with more bread making tips.